everyone, and welcome to Second Features. For this month's podcast, we are looking at a really fascinating Polish film from the 1980s called Sexmission. And we have a very special guest on to talk about the film, but I'll allow Adrian to get to that in a second. Before we do, I just wanted to ask you, Adrian, you've wanted to do this film since we started the podcast. Like, that's always been uppermost on your list. We've got to do Sexmission. So what is it about this film that you really sort of are obsessed by? What fascinates you about it? Why this one?
It's fun. I don't know. It's the film I've probably been the most fascinated by since, because jumping ahead here, but this was shown on Channel 4 in 1991 on an evening, and I would have been 15, and I was on holiday in a caravan park somewhere near Weston-super-Mare with my mum and my sister.
I don't know why I laughed at that.
I know.
It just sounds funny. It's like a very British thing.
It is. It was very British. There was cabaret, there was kids clubs, all of that. It was like a low budget Butlins. And yeah. So I have memories of this being on and me seeing the trailer for it on the television in the caravan during the day, and thinking, I've got to see this film. But at the same time, the evenings at these places are spent basically running between the disco and other people's caravans with my friend who I'd made on the holiday. So I was trying to watch bits of the movie in different caravans as I ran around the campsite. So my memory of it is trying to watch this film, but being constantly interrupted by being on holiday. So I've got very specific memories of particular scenes, which I'll get into later, including the ending. And then for years later, just been thinking, what was that I saw? What did I see? And wanting to explore it a bit more. And it wasn't until last year that I finally got to see the film in its entirety.
So what did you think when you finally got to see it in its entirety? What was your reaction?
So I was very pleased at how good it was.
Okay,
basically.
That's interesting.
So, yeah, I enjoyed it very much. So yes, I've been interested in this film for a long time, and it wasn't very easy to see. So every few years, like to begin with, I thought I'd remembered the name, but I was obviously very nervous to Google Sexmission. Because,
I would, especially on a work computer.
Yeah. So so every few years, I would do a search for it online, and it would be available on some Polish VHS that you had to spend a fortune on trying to get hold of. And it was just very difficult to get hold of. I mean, but in Poland, it's a huge cult film. So our guest today is the Polish film scholar Michal Oleszczyk, who is a teacher at the University of Warsaw and a film writer, and he will hopefully give us the story from the Polish perspective. But for me, it was this film that I caught this glimpse of as a teenager and been kind of hooked on it and just wanted to know more. And it took years and years and years until eventually I discovered that it had been shown at a film festival a couple of years ago. I think it was in Prague. And that Studio Kada, who is the kind of state I'm not sure if state is the right word now because they're not communist anymore, but the official film studios in Poland seem to run and control all Polish film, called Studio Kada, and they have done a full restoration of a lot of films in their archive, including this one. So there was this brand new restoration with English subtitles now available and put out on Blu-ray by Studio Kada.
Okay.
So
cool.
obviously once I found this out, that was it.
Yeah.
So I was finally able to piece those random images that I had from the film together. And it was interesting how much of the plot I'd remembered wrong.
Well, if you're only getting fragments, I imagine with this film particularly, that is kind of, I mean, it's just so weird. So it's a sex comedy. So it's the second sex comedy that we've done on this podcast. The first one was Eskimo Nell for our second episode. So
I'm going to get a reputation, I know. This is...
Well, you do keep suggesting them.
Well, I was more... I think, although the title is obviously suggests that this is a sex comedy, I would argue that it's more of a science fiction satire that just happens to have some nudity.
Well, I mean, that's kind of a theme with the sex comedies that I've watched as a result of you suggesting that I watch them, Adrian, in that they tend not to be about sex. They tend to be about something else, using that as a cover. And I think this is kind of the case here. I watched it for the first time before kind of recording this. I have never seen it before. As you've said, it's quite difficult to get hold of. So the film is about these two Polish scientists who are kind of put into hibernation in 1991. So the film is kind of set in 1991. It was made in 1985, so still when kind of Poland is under communism, but set in 1991. And these two scientists are put into hibernation, and they're meant to be awoken 3 years later, but instead they end up being awoken in like 2044, and they realize after they wake up that something has happened to remove all men from society. Society is now run by women. It's a matriarchy. And, they have to kind of deal with that. I won't give away too many spoilers at this point. So it's a pretty fantastical plot, but buried under, I mean, not even buried under there. There's a kind of satire of communism. And of the state, which is kind of, I mean, it's kind of fascinating that it was released in the first place, and this kind of passed, not unnoticed, but not as noticed as you might have thought. Like, it was given a release.
Yeah, it's one of those great examples that we see all the way through film history, really, of science fiction being used really effectively to comment on current politics or world events or whatever. And here, it's kind of amazing that they were able to make an anti-authoritarian satire in communist Poland and completely get away with it. And I've been reading a little bit about the film. What information there is out there would suggest that they had to get their scripts approved, and it was all approved, and it was all fine. The only place where the film really got censored after it was made was in Russia, where they cut about 40 minutes out of the film.
I was reading about that. Like, they cut all the sex bits out. Yeah. And it's a sex film.
I know. Well, I mean, really, if the Russians were cutting the wrong bit out, because really what they wanted to be cutting out was all the stuff about how terrible communism is. Yeah. Because that's really where the thing is. So the film, like you said, it's a sort of this matriarchy, and some critics of the film, and we'll look at some reviews later, but some critics have said that this is an anti-feminist film, that it's some kind of fear of what would happen if we let women be in charge. But the director always argued that was not anything to do with it, that it was definitely about communism and about authoritarianism. It's not about how terrible it would be if women were in charge.
There is a lot of that, though. It does seem to be an anti-feminist film.
Yeah,
I look at things in context, so I don't find the film from 1985 I don't find the sex comedy from 1985 massively offensive because it's a sex comedy from 1985. But there is a sort of, the gender comedy aspect of it. I guess was read badly at the time, I think, as well, because, I read a review for, I think, Monthly Film Bulletin where they were like, this is a bit...
Well, I mean, Time Out described it as extremely misogynistic. I mean, I would argue perhaps incorrectly, and I'm treading on eggshells possibly here, but for me it seems to be, as well as satirizing this authoritarian world, it's also satirizing masculinity. These men who think they can fix the world just by kissing everybody.
Oh God.
You know, his kind of assumed superiority. Because you see, you've got these two men. One of them is a scientist. He's very serious. The other one appears to have mainly done the experiment for the money, and he's much more of a player. He smuggled booze and alcohol in his hibernation pod and all this kind of thing. And he really thinks that he's God's gift to women. And he falls on his arse a few times. Like it doesn't work. Like he doesn't just woo and charm all these women because of how great he is. So I think you could argue that they are just as much the butt of the joke.
Yeah, totally. And that guy, the guy who's the player, is so like I don't want to be unkind, but he's not your typical assumption of a romantic lead, and he's kind of like a bit pathetic. Yeah. So yeah, actually in sex comedies a lot of the time you find that male characters are constantly made to look inadequate and feel inadequate and be inadequate. Like there are lots of moments in this film where that scientist is over explaining things to women or thinking that he's God's gift and getting undermined or beaten up. So there definitely is that element. But
and they also the men are also filmed naked. It's not to a point. So the sort of the nudity in the film is fairly equally spread.
I wouldn't say it's equally spread,
not necessarily, because there's only two guys and lots of women.
Yeah.
But there's a great scene when they're just in the shower, and it's filmed in this kind of very voyeuristic way, and it's being watched on video by some of the women. And yeah, so they're just as much of, well, okay, not just as much, but they are certainly part of that kind of view, as well as the way.
Would you like a shovel, Adrian?
I know. This is what I've been worried about the whole time, is that I'm just going to dig myself into a big hole. But
no, it's I do kind of agree with you that it's not really meant to be mean towards women. It's not particularly kind of, if it's anti-feminist, it doesn't have teeth. It's largely kind of, the director wants to discuss, or kind of, it's meant to be a sort of 1984 style political satire, right? Yeah. That's kind of the aim. And it's also meant to be a homage to everything Kubrick, because clearly, just from my sense of watching this film, is that the director is a massive fan of Kubrick and has built that into the film. There's elements of Dr. Strangelove in there, very much. So it's kind of trying to be more of a political satire.
Yeah, and obviously sort of 2001, the sort of look of the film, once they get into the futuristic underground world. I should probably just briefly explain. So once they get woken up, and that's when they discover that this society is ruled by women, but also there was a war. So they've slept through a war when this scientist who invented the hibernation technique then invented a chromosome bomb called the M bomb, which would kill the male chromosome. Why somebody would invent that?
It's not explained why he did that, and why people generally accepted that was fine.
So this bomb has gone off, and all the men have died. But then there's the side effect has been radiation, and the Earth it's just this irradiated wasteland. So they all live underground now in this mine that's been converted, and it is a really futuristic looking, very very low budget, but still very futuristic looking city. And I love the visual design of the film, how they were able to build all this stuff in this little studio out in the middle of nowhere in Poland. And there's also some use of miniatures to make the world seem bigger than obviously what they could pull off. Some of the time the sets just look like they've got a load of black bin bags and stuck them to a wall.
I'd be interested to know what the budget was.
Yeah, not much, I don't think. The director, I'm really worried about all the names I'm going to get wrong. So the director is Juliusz Michalski, and he had made some other films before this, but he was still relatively young at the time. I think he's only in his early 30s. And so I think it was fairly low budget. But what they did with it, and again, that's one of the things that's great about sci-fi, is that you can shoot things on quite a low budget, but if it's a high concept, you could get away with it.
But I do think we should really explain the plot, because I don't think many people are going to be able to find it, or can. Is it available?
Yeah. It's on Blu-ray. So I bought it's on Blu-ray from Poland, which, because the internet is quite easy to navigate, it's not that difficult to buy. If you wanted to get it, I highly recommend it. It is an experience, because I just think it's really fascinating. Again, with all this, when you think about the context of when this film was made, where it was made, and I really love films that are constantly just, where you're watching a film and your jaw just kind of drops when you can't believe that they actually did that. Particularly, I don't know if we want to give full spoilers, but the closing shot of this film.
I've never seen that before.
I know.
You don't see many films where the closing shot of the film is that.
Yes, and that's something that's stuck in my head for the
let's not spoil it, because
years.
let's let people experience that for themselves.
Yes, exactly. I agree. But so it's things like that where you can't believe that they did this and got away with it, and that's what I love about films like this. So even if there may be elements that are problematic, and I'm not going to try and defend it entirely, but I still think it's so interesting.
Well, from a modern perspective, from a mid-80s perspective.
Yeah, and there are definitely bits of it that feel like it could have been a sketch on the Benny Hill show.
Yeah, there's comedy noises in places which I could have done without. Really could have done without those. Like the boing noises. It's not necessary.
There's a lot of women on roller skates. And stuff like that. These sort of very sort of typical
choices.
This is what this is sort of typical. What will it look like in the future? Well, all the girls will be on roller skates and walking around topless quite a lot, and all of that sort of stuff.
I think the sort of women being topless, doing sports, there's the two scientists are underground and they're watching the telly, they're locked in their kind of chamber, they're being dehibernated and they're watching telly, and there's women doing sort of sports, playing football and swapping their shirts. There's an idea of asexuality there, because if there's no men, then there's no reason to be hide the female form. So there's a kind of, it's meant to be sort of asexual, but then the men are quite titillated by it.
But also it's revealed that the women are all constantly being made to take these pills, and the pills repress their sexual urges and turn it into a desire to work.
That's pretty anti-feminist.
Yeah. So this is how the ruling elite of this world are controlling the women in this underground thing. They're making them basically medicated, so that any sexual desires that they may have had
become career ambitions.
Become career ambition. And I bet also because most of these women have never seen a man, and there's a great scene later on. Well, again, I use the word great loosely. There's a significant scene when the guys have escaped and they're in a lift, and this lift keeps stopping at different floors, and one of the floors it stops at is a swimming pool. And there's a woman who just gets into the lift, strips off completely naked in front of them, and then gets out and gets straight into the water, and another woman talks to them, and they keep calling them sisters. They just assume that these men are women because they don't know what men are. There's no kind of recognition that there is any need to worry about nudity because everybody is the same.
Yeah, that was a kind of interesting point, that nobody's seen a man, so obviously they're just taken to be women, and they can kind of disguise themselves that way. Yeah, so we have this scenario, thousands of women trapped underground, and there's this lie. So there's the kind of state system, the women are medicated, and there's this sort of lie that the surface has been irradiated, and maybe at some point it was, but in fact, that's kind of a big spoiler, but things may not be kind of as they seem. Yeah. So everybody's being fed this lie and being medicated, and then these two guys come along and they sort of expose the lie. And one of the ways they do this is that, they're guys, and they basically reawaken sexuality, heterosexuality.
Yeah, by trying to kiss as many women as they can.
And the first time this happens, the sort of player scientist, the kind of vaguely pathetic one, kisses one of the guards, and she suddenly starts to kind of have sexual fantasies, and she's like, what's going on?
So she's really interesting. So her character is called Lamia, and she originally, the movie was going to be called Lamia. That was the original title, apparently. And it's almost, although we've got these two guys, it's kind of Lamia's story. She is the one who she works in this department. There's two main departments, it seems, as well. They're all scientists, but you've got archaeo, which are the archaeologists, and then you've got the genetics people, and there's this tension between the two groups. So she's found these guys and woken them up, so they're her property, and she's writing a thesis on them, and she's always talking about her degrees and how well educated she is. But the genetics people want to do experiments on these guys, and she's trying to stop them from being experimented on by saying, well, let's just have them naturalized, meaning let's give them drugs and turn them into women. But yeah, so Lamia, she is the one who starts to be, it's like she starts to wake up from the lie because her world has been disrupted by these men coming into it. And obviously then, what's his name, Maximilian, kisses her, and she starts to kind of, she's never had human contact like that before. Because also they all wear gloves as well. It's a very kind of non-tactile world.
Yeah, they're not meant to sense. Yeah. It's not sensory, this world.
Which again, I hate to bring this up, but in this day and age where we're all afraid to touch anything that's been touched by somebody else or touch each other, and it seemed eerily prescient.
We don't live underground though, and the surface hasn't been irradiated, and men do exist.
My son hates me saying that. Whenever we're watching a film and I go, "Oh, that's a bit light now," he wants to punch me. But anyway, that struck me as being quite funny. But yeah, so they're not allowed physical contact, and obviously they're taking these drugs to repress any sense of sexuality. So Lamia starts to wake up, and that's when she starts to question what's going on. She starts to do her research. She wants to go and talk to the oldest woman in the society who remembers what men were like. And she goes to visit this old woman, and that's when they watch this video of the naked men in the shower.
Yeah.
And this old woman is really excited by this because she remembers what men were like.
And she's trying to explain, basically it's Lamia says, what is the purpose of men? Because the lie is so profound that people have forgotten history in its entirety. So this society of women believe that every aspect of human history was female. One of the great quotes in the film, and I think people often quote this who are fans of the film, is Einstein was a man, because
woman.
Well, Einstein was a woman. Sorry.
Yes.
Because they think all the kind of all the scientists in history were women. Everyone who's ever discovered anything was a woman.
Which is and again that sort of has echoes of 1984 and the totalitarian regimes rewriting their histories to suit their ideology, and that's exactly what this society has done. They've rewritten history.
It's been so rewritten that nobody actually remembers what men did or what they were for. So Lamia is like, well, what is the purpose of men? What did you use them for?
For entertainment. And she's like, oh, we've got TV for that now.
But yeah, the lack of sort of sensing in the society kind of extends to like the food. So people don't eat food anymore. It's all synthetic. So yeah, Lamia takes this jar of jam to this old lady, and the old lady has not tasted it for like, decades and decades, 50 years or something. So it's like the sensory awakening is kind of happening. And then when she sees images of the men on the TV, the old lady kind of gets really excited and goes, "Oh my god, this is great. This reminds me of my fiance that I had back in the day."
And then she has to explain what her fiance is.
Yeah,
that's the scene where you see this very lingering, the camera very lingering over their bodies in the shower. Which something I wanted to mention in general was the cinematography. I don't know if you noticed this, but it only really struck me when I watched it again. The cinematography is very odd. The way that everything is lit, and it seems to all been shot through gauze or something. Like when you see a light on the screen, there's this huge sort of bokeh effect.
It's like the lens has been smeared with Vaseline.
Yeah, it's really odd, and so you get quite interesting lighting effects, and so in that shower sequence, it looks like something from a porn film in the way that the camera's kind of panning in slow motion up and down their wet bodies, and the light is all glistening off them. And but that the whole film is shot like that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there are equal amounts of nudity, but I do think that there's this idea of like rediscovering rediscovering sexuality and rediscovering gender and how gender interacts is kind of interesting.
I mean, there's certainly I would say there's certainly objectification on both sides, but there is full frontal female nudity in this film, but not full frontal male nudity.
That might be a censor thing.
Yeah,
like maybe
possibly.
That wouldn't. I don't know.
Well, I said that there is some full frontal male nudity, but we don't want to go. We don't need to go into that.
Let's not go into that.
But yeah, I've been, again, a little bit like when we did Shogun Assassin. I have been worrying about what you would think of this film when we finally did it, because it could go kind of either way. This could be the most offensive film that anyone has ever seen, or
like I watch a lot of cult cinema and study a lot of like low budget kind of sex films, horror films, and I'm not kind of offended by something out of context that was doing a particular thing at the time. But I mean, my thoughts on the film aren't related to like, it's more about the artfulness of it or lack thereof. When it comes to sort of the context in terms of the political context and the place that it holds in Polish cinema, I can't really talk that much about that. And there's probably a lot of references in the film that kind of passed me by. But there are also kind of elements of it that seem quite unsubtle. And I'm not just talking about the sex stuff, I'm talking about the political stuff. I mean, it feels really heavy-handed. And I just think, a bit more, I would have liked to come to it with a bit more room for interpretation, but it feels like everything is kind of laid out. And that was kind of, if I had one main issue with it, that would be the main issue, to be honest.
That's interesting. Yeah, it does lay it on pretty thick. And you can sort of see why it must have been really interesting for audiences at the time, and perhaps this is something we can talk about with Michael, that to have this very obviously anti-authoritarian film being screened in an authoritarian country. I can't quite get my head around what that must have been like for audiences.
Yeah, and I'm really keen to talk to Michael about that, and also just ask why this film is, it's been so popular. Loads of people in Poland know about this film. People elsewhere don't really know about it at all. And there's even a video game based on this film. Seriously?
Yeah, back in the 90s.
But I was reading that was it in the late 80s? There were kind of, those best of film lists that people do. What is the best film of all time? Polish audiences were polled on the best films of all time. And in 3 separate polls, they chose Sexmission. And this was massively surprising because it wasn't considered to be a critical success. But audiences consistently kind of seem to love it. People reference it all the time in Poland. It's kind of part of Polish culture.
Yeah. When you think about Polish film, we think about the more art house stuff. No one's... we've not, you think like Kieslowski and Jerry Skolimowski and all these kind of guys, but I can see certain critics being disappointed that Sexmission might come top of a list and not a short story about killing or something like that. But, I mean, that just popular films. What can you do? As I mentioned, it was shown on Channel 4, which I know you've done a lot more research in that area than me. I had the suspicion that this was shown as part of their Red Triangle thing, but then I looked it up and it wasn't. I think the Red Triangle was earlier. Yeah,
I think that was earlier. But Channel 4 did screen a lot of weird and wacky stuff from all around the world as part of their sort of international film strands. So there's loads and loads of stuff, actually. The cultural legacy of Channel 4 and those late night films in the 80s and early 90s is such that there's just tons of stuff that British people only know about because they tuned into Channel 4 at 10 o'clock when they were 13 and were like, oh.
I know. I mean, that's it. I was exactly the right age to be, and I mean, I've always sought out, even for as long as I can remember, I've always sought out weird films that no one else has ever heard of. And I would be taping stuff on video back in the 80s, and late night horror films and stuff that my friends weren't generally into. And so for there to be a film called Sexmission, which is a Polish sci-fi, for a 15-year-old who's into weird films, that ticks a lot of boxes.
Yeah, I mean, when I read the synopsis, I thought, this is very intriguing. So I'm glad you suggested it. I'm glad I've had a chance to see it. I tend to look at, I like kind of searching out very weird stuff. I like what it tells us about the hidden things that films like this can tell us about politics and culture that we wouldn't normally know about, because the film canon is curated over the years in certain ways, and we have ideas of what's rated and what's not, but sometimes when you dig beneath it, you can find really surprising things. I also love films like this just because they're often so shoddy is like, they're often low budget, they're often a bit kind of done off the cuff, they're kind of not technically amazing, but there's also always bits in films like these, or in bad film, where there's a sense of like an amazing kind of shot, or an amazing sequence, or a series of genuinely creative choices. And the thing about kind of cult cinema, or I don't know if I wanted to use the term bad film, but schlocky stuff, is that, when you watch stuff like this, your technical kind of badness, or things that are at variant with the norm in film, are really noticeable. Like, you notice it when a shot is slightly wrong, because you're so indoctrinated into how media and film works. Like, it's the air that we breathe as we grow up. So yeah, you really notice a weird shot, but you also really notice like a really cool shot in films like this. I don't know if that makes sense. So there's a sense of really engaging with the nature of what film is technically. And Sexmission kind of has interesting like elements of that.
Yeah, you can see them really sort of stretching the limitations of their budget, and just trying to be really imaginative in terms of how can we make this look like the future. And there are just really weird little things that I liked, like when there's a point where the sort of the police, or whatever they are, the guards, they have to go and find these guys because they've escaped. And there's this great sequence where you're seeing all these women in their helmets, and they're very sort of SS styled black uniforms, and they're running after these guys. And then there's a bit where they all jump onto this big slide, and they're kind of going down the funhouse slide that you'd get at a fun fair to get to this craft that then's going to drive. And it's all that kind of, it reminded me a little bit of UFO or Space 1999 in the way that they were doing that. And there's another bit when you just see a wide shot of a sort of city area, and women are just sitting on these little swings, just gradually moving across the top of the screen, like that's their way of getting around, is to be transported.
The imagination of it is really interesting.
And I think it's quite well, it is very well made, even just down to little things like things are seeded quite early on. Like we see when they first manage to get out of their rooms, we see a bucket and a mop just randomly in a corridor, and then later on in the film when they escape, one of the guys gets his foot stuck in a bucket, and there's a comedy, hilarious
a comedy noise.
Charlie Chaplin style comedy as he runs down the corridor, but that's only funny because we've seen the bucket about half an hour earlier. So there's a certain level of sophistication, even if the jokes themselves are pretty broad for the most part.
Genetyk Spring do sekcji specjalnej. Alarm dla sektora północno-wschodniego, powtarzam. Alarm dla sektora północno-wschodniego. Podaj kod, odbiór. JS 18447. OL 70946. Zrozumiałam. Setka. Nie ma impulsu. 75. Nie ma impulsu. 50. Nie ma impulsu. 25.
są słabe impulsy.
So you mentioned earlier in the recording the monthly film bulletin review, and it's interesting the two sort of opposing reviews. I mean, I already mentioned the Time Out one saying it was misogynist, and then Monthly Film Bulletin, which was another British publication, they say they're quite negative about the film.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, that it's not funny, and that if it's a satire of, if you're supposed to look at it as an allegory of the Polish state, then it, as a joke, it says as a joke it must be in very poor taste, and to a woman it is simply contemptible, which that's fair enough. I'm not going to try and defend that. But then they start talking about whether if you're viewing it as a sex comedy, it still doesn't really add up. It says the Sexmission is a carry-on without Kenneth Williams, which I thought was quite funny, and I could just imagine Kenneth Williams in this film. But yeah, so they basically are very negative and end with it saying that it's offensive, which again, I can totally appreciate that, and particularly when this review is published in 1985, and I think that's fair enough. But it's an interesting comparison with the Variety review from summer of 1984, which is far more positive.
Okay, well, give us some highlights from the Variety review.
Yeah, well, mainly it's sort of a plot summary, but it says the jokes begin right away as lovely, enticing young ladies happen on the scene to watch over them and monitor their every wish. And then it talks about Maximilian being a woman chaser and having a lot to learn. But then, so it closes by saying, although not up to the standards of those quality Polish pics of the late 1970s, Sexmission is nonetheless the best pick to emerge from the Warsaw studios over the past season.
Is that a really backhanded insult to the Warsaw studios of that year?
Well, I mean, we'd have to watch more films from Poland in 1984, I suppose. To
yeah,
be
I suppose
sure.
we would, yeah.
Which I'm not necessarily sure I want to do just yet. But yeah, so definitely it received a mixed response, and perhaps the comedy was far more appreciated in Poland than it would appear to be outside of Poland. And yeah, the comparisons with this you could see this as a sort of science fiction carry-on film.
The Carry On team didn't do a science fiction film, did they?
No, I would imagine.
That's weird. It's weird that they didn't.
Yeah, I just think it was probably more, unless they could have got onto a set of an existing Carry On as an existing sci-fi film like they did with Cleopatra, Carry On Cleo. Sci-fi is more. Whereas all they've got to do is put some sand in a car park at Pinewood, and they can do Carry On Abroad for about 50p. Whereas sci-fi requires a bit more of budget, I suppose. But yeah, it's the monthly film bulletin review is finding the whole thing quite offensive in the way that it takes these men to come in to kind of wake up Lamia from her slumber and help her to realise through their masculinity that the world does need men after all.
It's like, I mean, it's a very heterosexual film.
Yeah.
Like, okay, so sex and sexual desire have been eliminated, and we do see scenes. There's kind of this moment where the scientists end up going like further underground, and they discover this bunch of people who are like hedonists. So they're living outside society.
Yes,
and there's women.
They're not
like,
taking the drugs.
Yeah, they're not taking the drugs, and there's people kissing and dancing, and they're all women. So there's nods to other, like a range of sexualities, but there's a kind of assumption that all women need are men. Like we just need basically the Time Out review says, where is it? Here we go. Michalski's comic strip fantasy may be intended as a withering satire on any form of authoritarianism. Quite frankly, it fails partly due to a stance that may easily be interpreted as extremely misogynistic. That all these futuristic femmes need is a good hetero fuck, etc., etc. And partly because it simply isn't funny. So all you need is a good hetero fuck, which I guess you can kind of read it that way. Yeah,
you certainly can. But I think that it's the anti-communist satire that is really where its heart is at. I think. Okay, so I'd like to welcome to the podcast Michal Oleszczyk. I hope I'm saying that right.
Perfect. I'm surprised because usually it gets mangled, but thank you so much.
And Michal teaches film at the Liberal Arts Department at the University of Warsaw. And he also writes for Cineast and RogerEbert.com. You can find him also on Twitter talking about film and all of that sort of thing. So Michal, thank you for coming on to Second Features. Now, we've just been talking about Sexmission, a film that was my idea to watch. Laura was unfamiliar with this movie.
I was on board with it though.
Yeah.
After I read the Wikipedia synopsis and thought that sounds fascinating.
Yeah. So this is a film that I was aware of and I really like, but I know very little about it and its kind of cultural and historical context. And so we were hoping that you might be able to fill in some of the gaps for us with this movie. I mean, I understand that it's just hugely popular in Poland. So maybe we can start with that. Is that true? And if so, why do you think it's so popular?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure, and I was so surprised when actually you approached me about this particular film because it seems to me I was born in 1982, so basically 2 years before this movie hit the Polish screens. It seems to me such a purely Polish phenomenon and very insular artifact of late communist culture that it never ceases to amaze me when someone discovers this movie from the outside world, let's say, outside of the former Eastern Bloc. So I was surprised but I'm very happy to talk about it. I think it's a film that's very entertaining. I think it's also very problematic, especially in today's culture, and we can discuss that as well. But yeah, to answer your question, it's been a hugely popular film in Poland and also in Eastern Bloc generally. I know that, for example, in Soviet Russia, right after it opened, although it was called something different because they couldn't use the word sex in the title, so they retitled the film for the Soviet Union as New Amazons, and it won, I think, some sort of a popular poll for the best movie of the year. But really, what I want to stress is that this is something more than just a popular movie. It's a pop cultural phenomenon. It's a film that's been playing on Polish TV for years, a film that people quote from memory, a film that's, some lines from the film are highly quotable and are being quoted very often. And it's a shorthand. It's a cultural shorthand. Sexmissia for this sort of, let's say, anti-totalitarian comedy sci-fi that the film represents. So it is. I grew up in a world in which this movie was a constant point of reference. So. And then I haven't seen it in a number of years. So I rewatched it specifically for this podcast, which was an interesting, experience. But yes, this was a big hit. It opened in the symbolic year 1984, the Orwellian year, and it grossed an amazing amount of money. I think that around 14 million Polish people saw this movie when it opened. And if you remember that this is a country of roughly around 40 million people, then it's basically a box office result that's impossible to recreate today.
That is phenomenal.
Yeah,
it's kind of explaining to me when I read these, there was like these polls, best film, what is the best film polls from Poland in the 80s. 3 of them were, basically Sexmission came top of popular film polls in the 1980s. And I watched the film. I couldn't really make sense of why, but not because it's especially bad, but just because a cult sex comedy generally doesn't end up being top of best film polls. But this is starting to make a lot of sense, what you're telling us, I think, because I wasn't aware of how popular it was.
It is. It still is. And I mean, obviously, there are so many topics here that could be approached, but I think it's key to remember that the movie opened right after the martial law was actually ended in Poland, because martial law begins late 1891. It ends in July 1983. So, and still, of course, 1980s is a very bleak decade in Poland. It's really bleak in terms of political persecution, in terms of real shortages of everything, which actually you can even see in the film because it's made, on such a shoestring budget. But people were so depressed in so many ways in the 80s that this movie, with its very clear Orwellian edge, definitely spoke to people that were still under the totalitarian regime. So here, this sort of anarchic energy, of this totalitarian state of women being dismantled, it was a clear, some sort of a metaphor for the communist state at that time. So for people, it was also a subversive act to laugh at the bureaucracy at the film, depicted the film. So.
And were there kind of censorship issues? Because, I haven't really been able to find much out about the time of release.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And, you can be still, I think, surprised by the amount of nudity in the film, which wouldn't be allowed, I think, in a PG rated American film of that period.
No.
All those, naked breasts and...
Especially not The Last Shot.
Yes, and this is probably the only film in the history of the world which ends on a prolonged freeze frame of a penis.
Yeah, we were going to leave it a secret, but I think we might just keep that in.
No, I cannot imagine. I mean, it's almost like a Warholian experiment. I think that only Andy Warhol could end his film like that. It's startling. It's startling. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nudity in the film. Full frontal female nudity, for example. So, but the issue here is to remember that throughout the 80s, the censorship in Poland, when it came to sexual stuff, it actually became much more relaxed. That was a time which was so politically fraught that it was thought that, if movies become a little bit more erotic, then people may be lured to forget about the political troubles. You wouldn't have this kind of nudity in a 1970s Polish comedy.
I mean, you would have it in a British comedy of the 70s, because I think we try to get people to go to the cinema by putting lots of breasts on the screen, But I was actually wondering if the censorship related to the subversive criticism of this regime. Rather, I wasn't really thinking about nudity, but actually, I can see your point. Yeah, there's a lot of nudity. Right. But were people? Was there a sense that this was just like, I don't know, maybe catharsis, I guess?
Yeah, there was this cathartic element, and Polish. You have to remember that in the 80s, Polish filmmakers have been already in their fourth decade of playing a very elaborate game with the censorship, and they knew how to do it, how to sort of smuggle subversive ideas into films. One usual ruse was to include too many political jokes in a film with a certainty that at some point the censor will cut some of them, but many of them will remain. And I think that was also an idea here. And of course, the sci-fi milieu makes it all much more clever, because it's not our world, it's a world 100 years from now or 57 years from now. So that was also, I think, that served as a sort of pacifier for the censorship.
That's a great point about sci-fi, because sci-fi, often we find critiques of totalitarian regimes in that genre precisely for that reason. It's a fantasy, guys.
Not our world, only we know this, right?
Yeah. I've seen some comments where the film was criticized as being anti-feminist, and this was something that that the director, I think, got quite cross about. Julius Michalski stated that it wasn't anti-feminist, that it was obviously more about satirizing communism. But what's your take on that? And was that ever an issue? Has that ever been an issue for the film over the last 30 odd years?
It's a growing issue for the film. I think, especially for today's young audiences, it's quite clear that there are some anti-feminist jabs, in the film, and I wouldn't deny that. I mean, Machulski can deny it, but I cannot deny it when I see it. There are some jokes that are very clearly have this sort of sexist underpinning. And even some lines that when examined closely, they are quite blatantly sexist. Like, for example, when I think it's Max who congratulates Lamia on the first manly decision that she ever made in her life. When she so there are some of it, I think it's inadvertent. Some of it's actually quite blatant. I think that, yes, ultimately the film is about totalitarianism. I think ultimately it's not an anti-feminist satire, but when you enter this field, of let's say what used to be called the battle of the sexes, right? I don't even know if that's still a concept, but then you enter quite a fraught territory, and I would say that the movie has some missteps in that area, but overall. I think lots of the humor is actually quite clever and actually at least, pinpoints some cultural tensions around masculinity. The men are also presented in quite a satirical way in it, and about femininity. However, I have no idea how this film would play, let's say, to a millennial audience today, because I think that there will be many scenes that will be found objectionable.
Yeah, I mean, the scene that comes to mind for me is when they're trying to find out what the password is to get out, and nobody knows the password, and eventually Max screams something quite obscene in frustration, and that turns out to be the password to get out.
Yes. However, you need to know, and this may be a bit of cultural trivia, is that what he screams is the most popular Polish swear word.
Is that kurwa?
Yes, exactly.
I like that word.
It's basically the Polish equivalent of the F word, which we use quite liberally and to great effect.
Okay.
So it's basically, the joke is that the password is the most common swear word in Polish language. That's
interesting, because the British subtitles add a bit more to that.
Well, the swear word has an anti, because it means a whore. Basically, the very swear word means whore. So once translated, it can, but it's been like dissociated from its original meaning, because it's like the F word. I don't know how many people think about sex when they speak the F word. It's like with the K word in Polish. When we speak it, we don't really think about sex workers. It's just this word, to vent your anger. So, but yeah, it's the word that's used as the password.
Okay, yeah. For me, it was quite shocking, that moment in the.
Was it? Bless you,
find
Adrian.
It's just another one of, not because I'm sensitive to bad words particularly, but just more, again, it's another there's quite a few moments in this film that surprise me that they would be that bold, like they would really go there. Obviously, we've already mentioned the ending shot, which is quite breathtaking.
Yeah, that surprised me, actually. None of the rest of it really did.
Yeah, but that whole password bit is another one where I just can't quite believe they went there.
Right.
Oh, I used to really like that word, because I spent some time in Poland 10, 12 years ago with a university friend and he taught me all the words and some phrases, and that was one of them. And everyone was saying it, and it was one of my favorite swear words.
It's usually the very first Polish word.
Yeah.
That's exactly the word. That's exactly the word.
Wow. So what do you think is obviously we've talked about how popular this film is and remains. What would you say is the legacy of Sexmission? There are other Polish science fiction films, and there is quite a thriving Polish film industry, but where does this film sort of sit within that, do you think?
Well, it's like a perennial classic, that's for sure, because it's a point of reference. It's a film that most people love. I would say that it also represents, and I think it's also the key to its appeal in some way, even if it's not conscious. The movie constituted an act of resilience, of imagination. Really, they had no money at all. I mean, this movie was made on such a small budget. It was a big leap of faith to make a science fiction movie in 1980s Poland, which you can tell that the stuff they used for the decoration is basically some garbage.
Yeah.
But Janusz Sosnowski, who was the art director for the film, I think he did an incredible job with so little that he had. And you can also tell, and this is, I think, the real key to success, is that Machulski really showed his directorial talent in the film. It has a good pace, the movie has an energy, it has a humor. You can also tell that he's a cinephile. There are obvious nods to Kubrick, because the opening, with the guy on the Kupelweiser, Dr. Kupelweiser on the wheel in the wheelchair, he's obviously Dr. Strangelove. And yes, Machulski was a big fan of 2001, the Kubrick film, and the movie's original title was 2044, something, an Odyssey, the working
A
title.
sex odyssey.
Sex Odyssey. So he knew, he wanted to pay a tribute to a genre that he loved, in a country that didn't have the resources to do it. Whatever he lacked in budget, he recompensed it for in energy, in filmmaking energy. So this compensates, I think, the obvious shortcomings and the funny makeup. And by the way, I just wanted to say that I think what's really most sexist about the film is the outfits, because it's a strange world of women who are all, wearing those very, tight.
Which, if it was an actual world of women, then there would be very long flowing outfits with large pockets.
Yeah, because
this is what the outfit would be.
Yeah.
And here you can tell that there's something, this male eye that apparently looks at them at all times. And and the swimming suits. It's a male fantasy. It's a heterosexual male fantasy in many ways. But yeah, I you cannot deny that there's spirit to the film. There's some energy. There's a joy of film.
I mean, it was sexist at the time, because obviously, and you can also read this in some of the reviews I kind of have found of the film. But on the other hand, I think, taking a sex film from the 70s or 80s to task for being sexist is like criticizing a sexist granddad who died 30 years ago. It's like, we know it's sexist. It's an interesting entry into the discourse of the era, if anything, into the sexism of the time. It plays differently today, but there's a lot going on.
Try playing Benny Hill today, and see how he chases those women around London. Or try playing the Carry On comedies. That there was plenty of sex.
I have tried. Yeah, I teach British cinema, so sometimes I have to.
So it's a product of its time, but also I think that also it actually expresses some tensions that are still circulating in the culture. It's not a dumb movie. I think it's actually quite an intelligent movie, which sometimes reveals some prejudice and some sexist streak in this culture.
I mean, that is what is interesting. I think film that is very that seems very alien from today can kind of familiarize us with the discourses of a culture that we are unfamiliar with now.
Absolutely.
And with these tensions, I think this is using film as a historic artifact in a way, as a source. You can kind of do that.
It's like a moth in amber, right? Like a mosquito in amber. You can see. Oh, so this is what culture was then, and it's fascinating. It's an artifact, but also I the performances. I think Jerzy Sztur and Olgierd Łukasiewicz as the guys. And the whole female cast is actually quite excellent. I like especially, I mean, Bożena Strykówna, who was playing Lamia, she was Machulski's wife, I think at the time. They divorced later on, but I wanted really to point out Ryszarda Hanin, who plays Jadwiga, actually Max's daughter, when when she takes revenge at the end, right, for being abandoned as an older woman. She was an excellent Polish actress of a terrific pedigree, theater actress and also film actress, and she gives a very powerful performance. And by the way, you can totally understand her anger at her father, who left her mother. There's no mocking of that anger. I mean, we know why she wants him killed. And I think that character is presented as fully in her right to take the revenge, because she was an abandoned child. So I think that's important.
Yeah.
Wow.
I was wondering, how common was it at the time for filmmakers to make films that were critical of communism and of the regime? Obviously, this one we've talked about being disguised as science fiction, but was anybody else really doing that at the time? I know that Machulski made King Size a couple of years after this, which is also kind of anti-authoritarian and as a fantasy, so slightly sci-fi. But was anybody else really doing that at the time?
Yes, actually quite a lot, more than you would assume, because that was part of the game, that many filmmakers were trying to criticize the system. Not necessarily, I would say, postulating the overthrow of the system, because in the 1970s you can see films that are trying to negotiate, like, okay, so what kind of a communism can we have? What kind of socialism? All you need to do is to see another Jerzy Sztur film, which is Camera Buff, the Krzysztof Kieślowski film, to see a film that's critical, but also it makes a point that maybe we can make this work. And I think that after the martial law, which is so brutal, there was no way that the movie would with a straight face propose, okay, let's make this work. No. And this is the big change, that after the martial law, there was this feeling that at least in a fantasy world, we can present this vision of a totalitarian regime being actually destroyed. And if you look at the last scene, forgetting the last shot, it's like an underground, like Solidarity, they are inseminating those, because it's like underground work, that will bear fruit only in 9 months in the future. So for Solidarity activists at that time, that had to be very poignant, because they were sowing the seeds for the future as well, as it were, right? So yeah, it was like, maybe not today, but maybe tomorrow we will be free. I find something to admire about that, actually.
I think the idea of repression stood out to me as well. So this is a society where sexual impulses are medicated away. Everyone is non-sexual. So it's it's not really queer in that women aren't having relationships with each other, except in one moment where we discover the people who are living outside society. But even then, it's quite heterosexual, like women are playing men and so forth. So yeah, the whole kind of sexual repression thing. Obviously, I'm guessing like the lack of, you can't show lesbians or gay men on screen. I'm guessing that's an issue.
You could point at that in a non-direct way. It was a taboo. It wasn't like an ironclad taboo. But here it's very interesting that you mentioned that the scene of the decadence, as it's called, that we hear jazz music being played.
Jazz music, the height of decadence.
in the 80s, right, where even Poland had a punk scene at that time, right? So and it was actually quite lively. So, but like with punk going on, you are showing this decadent life, which is this jazzy 1950s beatnik commune. That's I think quite quaint about the film. But yeah, it's there are many things that like the I don't know if you've noticed, there's a picture of the Pope at the beginning of the film when we are still in the present.
Oh yeah.
On the wall there's a picture of John Paul II, which and at some point Max says something like, oh, who knows what the world will be in the future, maybe we'll meet Gagarin or somebody like that. And it's very clear that he's talking about the Pope, who at that time was seen as a political figure too, right? Of someone who was challenging communism. And they actually crossed themselves before the hibernation.
Yeah.
So that's not something you see in Kubrick. So there are those cultural signifiers that we are in a Catholic country, I think.
Mm.
But it is a fascinating fascinating film.
And of course, I mean, speaking this idea of you talked about martial law, and obviously they're led to believe that they're living underground because of radiation, but then that also turns out to be a lie, and that as well as being repressed through those pills, the community is being repressed by being forced to live underground when they don't need to. It's all part. It's all this big lie. Their whole lives are a lie, and that seems to be perhaps the most critical element of the whole thing for me, that this whole society is built on a lie.
And the lie is that you cannot go to the surface because there's this radiation. And they discover that there is no radiation, it's fine. And if you remember about all the lies that were being said about the West in general, right? That, the West is corrupt, the West, you shouldn't want to go to the West because it's, everything, the worst, it's the worst thing. Then, obviously the surface is like a metaphor for the Western world. And, for me, it's very clear that, and also the theme of propaganda, right? The TV that tells you, this is the way how the world is. Actually, the world is nothing like the propaganda says. And this anarchic spirit, I think that was quite, it was even in Macholski's style. I mean, it's clear that he enjoys making movies, and he even throws in something as old-fashioned as a pie fight, when they are fighting with the pies. It's like slapstick, like Fatih Arbuckle, because he likes movies. He's a movie crazy director that really likes old films, and you can tell that he likes them.
There's something really anarchic built into like the genre of sex comedy as well. Just that it does seem to have a kind of physical comedy, a slapstick, but also an anarchy of anything can happen, and energy. Like actually the Carry On films have that anarchic energy, even though we now think of them as being quite old-fashioned. That's something I saw in Sexmission as well. And maybe it's no coincidence that it's a sex comedy that is anarchic.
Don't you love those old sex comedies? I mean, especially, you mentioned the repressiveness and the stereotypes, but they are really fascinating when you watch like those sex farces of 1970s, even American films. You can tell so much about the culture just by how sex is being presented. What jokes can you make? It's, I recently watched this sex comedy from the 60s with James Garner. It was That Wonderful Feeling or something like that. There was this whole wave of those sex films in the 60s. And some of the jokes were so shocking from today's point of view, regarding sexual violence, like stalking and stuff. But it's kind of, you get this X-ray of
these films make us feel really tense. Not just because they're rude, although I think I don't care that they're rude, but it's more that the sexual politics are just like, ugh. And the way that sexual violence and things are discussed in these films from many decades ago, it's just really, it can be really horrible to watch. There is a kind of so we've lost the way of understanding the generic tropes of things, but also there's a lot in there that actually, like when me and Adrian watched this sex comedy called Eskimo Nell, which I thought, this is going to be shit, from 1975, British sex comedy, one of the most interesting films I've actually seen, because it was an aspect of the national cinema that had been lost to me, that we then kind of accessed, and actually it wasn't really as sexist as it appeared.
Right.
So it was very interesting. I think these films can be really interesting.
They are, and
Yeah.
I don't even know what to think of some of parts of Sexmission, to be honest. Like, the whole idea that Jerzy Sztur is presented as someone who could cause a sexual awakening in a woman just by briefly kissing her, and she's suddenly overwhelmed.
That guy causes a sexual awakening in a woman just by kissing her is the joke.
Yeah.
Because it's that guy.
Yes, and the other guy is actually much more handsome. But this, and when he blows the smoke, like very like in a sexual.
And his tiny shorts.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Yeah, so it's an interesting artifact. The question is what to tell your kids today when you show them this film. Like what kind of an introduction should you be making? That's interesting.
Is this a film that you use that you teach in your work?
I don't teach it on a regular basis, but I actually, after this podcast, I'm going to return to it, because I had a bad experience of showing it once to students, and they were quite offended actually by it. It wasn't part of a regular class though. But I'm starting to think that maybe we should teach those very controversial, and maybe, because if we avoid discussion about them, if we just put them in some secret stash and never approach them, then I don't think we are doing anybody in a service.
Yeah, it's quite hard though from a lecturer perspective, because they need so much contextualizing, understanding of history, discourse, the past, that if a lot of the students aren't paying attention to all of those contextualizing things, then they're just going to be like, what is this bullshit? And so it's actually really hard to do that.
Why does it end with a penis, right? I think that's the biggest question.
I wasn't talking specifically about Sexmission, but just in general, if you're showing some old culture which just looks really weird now, it's really kind of out of time now, and it just needs so much prerequisites of understanding about what this is.
Yes. I agree.
Yeah, so you get to the point when your trigger warnings become longer than the film itself.
That's when you have to stop. When your trigger warnings become longer than the film.
Yes, that's a great way of putting it.
But I do believe that pretty much any film can be put into context. But you've just got to.
Let's hope so.
But it can just be a lot of work. There's perhaps just one last thing I wanted to ask you about, just perhaps more broadly, something that the Polish film industry is quite well known for are the amazing the artwork on the posters. Very unique, and that you see collections, and I've been to galleries and seen collections of Polish film posters, and they are like nothing else. No other country does film posters like Poland, and I've been enjoying looking back at some of the posters for this film, but they're just in general, they're always amazing. Why does Poland have that tradition, and why can't we all make posters like that?
Yeah, it's an incredible tradition that's unfortunately it's no longer continued, or it's barely continued. The question, the answer is very simple. That there was this general idea of when it comes to movies, that they shouldn't be advertised by stills from the film, or it had to do with the communist state telling the Western marketing agencies, we will do it our own way, right? We'll do it. We don't want your American posters, basically. So we will design our own. And that was a good time for, graphic artists, for designers. And yes, there were great educational centers like, Academy in Krakow, Academy in Warsaw, that turned out a big number of very good designers who, and as long as, let's say, the Western capitalism didn't arrive here, that tradition was alive. But then it turned out that sexy poster of an actor or an actress with a photo, it's a shorthand. It doesn't need to be as refined artistically, but it does sell the film. To be honest and to be perfectly clear, not all of Polish posters were amazing. There are actually some that are quite bad. There are of course many masterpieces of Polish poster, but I really, I want to tell you, and I want to tell you listeners, to find out what was the Polish poster for the film Tutsi with Dustin Hoffman. I won't tell you now. Just
Okay.
Google it, and you will be
Okay.
quite surprised. So.
Okay.
So it is not a good poster.
Right.
Just to give you a clue.
Thanks very much, Michael.
Yeah.
That was a great question, Adrian. I
Yeah.
never would have thought to ask that. That was a fabulous answer too.
Yeah. So I mean, much the same obviously back up until the mid-80s, a lot of film posters in the West were hand painted as well. But then eventually just photoshopping and things just kind of gradually took over here. So it sounds like it's similar.
And the uniform, like it's the same poster. It's in the UK, it's in the US, it's here. And this part of those, this wonderful special quality is gone because it's one big market, basically. I want to say again, I'm very grateful, and I'm also excited that you dug up this little, a gem of a film from a forgotten era. So I'm very curious what the responses of your listeners will be, and I think it's an interesting film, and it was a pleasure to talk to you about it.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much.
So that's it for Sexmission. I hope that you are all intrigued enough to seek this out. You won't find it streaming online, I don't think, but it's worth the effort. Hopefully we've made you think it's worth the effort. And then you can form your own opinion on the film. So I'd like to thank our guest Michal Oleszczyk for coming on and enlightening us a bit more on the film, and particularly on its legacy in Polish cinema. So thank you everybody for listening. Please do follow us on social media for updates as to what we're doing, and let us know as well on there what you think. You can also leave us reviews in all the usual places, just like every podcast always begs you to do. It does help with getting us found by
if they're
more
good
people.
reviews, yeah.
If they're good reviews. Well, at the moment I'd take any reviews, I think. Anything would be fine, but it would be interesting to hear what you think about what we're doing, and of course tell your friends, spread the word. Let's try and reach more people with our film chat or whatever we call it.
And tweet us as well, because I always like that. I like those.
Yeah,
we're on at Second Features, but also you can tweet me. I'm at Laura Jane Main, and
I'm at Retro Ramblings. And you can also email us at secondfeaturespod@gmail.com. Thank you everybody for listening. Oh, what?
Nothing. I was just saying cool. Just signing off the podcast.
Oh, sorry.
It's another smooth ending. Another smooth ending for us.
Classic Second Features ending. Thank you everybody.
Yeah. We really need to find a way to segue gracefully out of these. Okay, I'm stopping now. I'm shutting up.
We need somebody to write us a script. Okay, thank you everybody for listening, and we'll be back next month. Bye.